Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific look at a car from the 1.19 patch. Now the last patch, we've had it again of course updated to 1.20, and this car is one which actually had a much better response from the community than I was expecting it to have. I don't recall a huge amount of people using this car in Gran Turismo 6. I know it had its fans, but I didn't used to see it online all that much. Now the car of course is the 2011 shape Renault Megane Trophy. Now back in the day I went to a Renault test day, they had a ton of these going around Silverstone. They sound great, they look the part. Personally I've always preferred the first generation Megane Trophy, which you don't really see in many racing games, but I think it looks way better than this one with the older shape. But either way, this is the one that we have in the game, and it's one of those cars which could very easily be really good, almost OP, or it could be really twitchy and unruly. Now when I first drove the car, I found it to be more so the latter, perhaps surprisingly because I know a lot of people are saying that this thing is a monster around the track. But on my second drive of the car, where I actually did tune it rather than driving it with the default settings that the game gives you, I actually found it to be a lot better. So this is for sure the kind of car which responds very directly to the kind of tuning that you do to it, in particular when it comes to the diff, because the first time I drove it I found it to be surprisingly slippery, definitely more so than it was on Gran Turismo 6, whereas when I retuned it and basically just changed the diff settings, it immediately became really good and makes full use of that low weight and the mid-engine rear-wheel drive layout. Now the car is, as I predicted, in Group 4, it makes sense. Some people were positing perhaps Group 3, that would have never really made sense, it just doesn't have the power to keep up with the Astons and Jags, regardless of balance of performance, it's just not that kind of car, whereas in Group 4 it's actually really well placed, but ironically, although it's not good enough in terms of power for Group 3, it's almost too good, at least without balance of performance in Group 4, because the weight is so low. It's got 359 horsepower, which is pretty good, that's well matched, but the weight is 955 kilos, well under a tonne, and consequently the horsepower per tonne, straight off the bat without even upgrading it, is already 376, which is really good for a car like that. In fact, that can quite easily rival some of the Group 3 cars. So that's pretty good straight off the bat. In fact, it only weighs about 10 or 15 kilos more than the Veyron does in Group 4 with the full weight loss package. Now, if you'll recall, I love that Veyron. It's easily my favourite Group 4 car, but only when you make it that light, because it's so cool to experience a Veyron like that. With this Megane though, it's much more believable. It's actually that lightweight in real life, for instance, so it's not this big ridiculous hulking thing that weighs barely more than a prototype, which takes a bit of suspension of disbelief. In the case of this car though, it's more believable. It's kind of like GT machine meets touring car to some degree. The Renaults always had a very interesting placement within the game, the Clio V6 Cup car, the Megane Trophy, this one of course. They're almost a category unto themselves, those one-make racing kind of cars where they're not full-on touring cars in a traditional sense, but they're not quite GT cars either. They have elements of both, a little bit of DTM style in there as well with the body kit. But as far as this car goes, it's 350 grand, which of course is well placed against all of the other Group 4 cars, and although I haven't driven it online, I should imagine it's a car that's probably quite heftily set back by balance of performance, because the weight is just so low. Of course you guys could confirm or deny that, but that wouldn't surprise me at all if they bumped the weight up by quite a lot to make the other cars at least have a chance against it. Now as far as torque, it's got a decent amount, 287 pound-feet, it's pretty good. As I said, 3.5 litre mid-mounted engine is also good. And on a slight side note, I actually meant to mention this at the start of the video, but I forgot. If you like the livery on this car, which incidentally I made and it's on my community page, and you find it reminiscent of something, it is of course the Espace F1. It's my homage to that car, my favourite car of the entire franchise. It makes sense. As far as I'm concerned, it's the closest thing that we can get to that kind of performance. It's still nowhere near, but at least it pulls off an interesting conversion to the shape of the Megane. So if you want to check that out, as I said, it is on my community page. Search the kind of tags that you'd expect to, such as Espace, and it's actually a more popular livery than I expected it to be, which is cool. It's nice to see the love for the Espace. But as far as its performance and the way it actually goes around corners in a straight line, it's a car that I would say feels, straight off the bat actually, a lot more useful, to be honest, than it was on Gran Turismo 6. On Gran Turismo 6, not only did I barely see anyone online using it, I never used it myself either. It was a car that, because of the fact that it wasn't quite that full-on touring car or full-on GT car, I would just always pass over it for the sake of something else. Because if you're going to go into GT racing, I'd just use something like an RX-8 race car or a Camaro race car or something like that. Whereas in the lower class stuff, I would be more inclined to use one of the sedans, like the BMW 320i or the Mazda 6 touring car. This one just kind of fell off for me, whereas now it almost feels like Group 4 is perfectly optimised for a car like this. It's got every advantage that you would want in that category. It's got great handling when you tune it correctly, it's got a ton of grip, great turn-in, it's very smooth as well, actually surprisingly forgiving, but only when tuned correctly. And the acceleration is good, the top end speed is pretty good for its power. It's not the most powerful thing out there, but of course you wouldn't want it to be in its category. And it's pretty good looking, I would say, as well, and sounds good as well. So it's pretty much got the all-round package that you would want from any race car, really, let alone a Group 4. Now, as far as tuning goes, I might put something out on the channel for this one, in the way of a circuit tune perhaps, but suffice it to say, if you haven't checked this one out and you do a lot of Group 4 racing, well, if you're a Group 4 racer, chances are you probably already have driven it and bought it, at least one. If you haven't, I would recommend trying it out. If you've driven it on Gran Turismo 6, and say for instance you're like me and weren't particularly a fan of it, I would actually encourage you to try it again, because it feels better now, it definitely feels more useful now, and it feels like it has a better home in this game than it did in Gran Turismo 6. For me, in GT6, it just got lost in the shuffle, whereas now, it almost feels more important. But that's it for this pick overall, of course. I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.